My peaceful creek became a battleground when the HOA declared it a danger to children and forced me to drain it. But they never expected what would happen when that water found a new path. There's something about the sound of running water that settles a man's soul. Maybe that's why I've always loved this creek, the way it winds through my backyard, its quiet gurgling like an old friend talking me through life's troubles. My name is Jacob Carter, and I've called this place home for nearly 2 decades. Long before Ridgewood Valley had neatly trimmed hedges, uniform mailboxes, and an HOA that thinks it can dictate how people live. I work with my hands, fixing pipes and plumbing disasters all over town. When the day's done, I come home, grab a cold drink, and sit by the creek. It's my sanctuary, the one place no one can touch, or so I thought. The neighborhood kids love it, too. Timmy and Sarah Thompson come by almost daily, their laughter mixing with the sounds of birds and frogs. Their parents trust me to keep an eye on them, and I do. What I didn't know then was that my peaceful creek, my sanctuary, was about to become a battlefield. And the HOA? They had no idea who they were messing with. The letter arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind that screamed self-importance. Ridgewood Valley Homeowners Association was embossed in gold across the top, as if it was some royal decree instead of a glorified neighborhood nuisance. I ripped it open, skimming the contents. Violation notice, unauthorized water feature. Immediate action required. I frowned. Water feature. It was a creek, not some man-made fountain in a fancy hotel lobby. The creek had been here before I bought the property, hell, before any of these houses were even built. I flipped through the pages, each one more ridiculous than the last. Fines, regulations, deadlines. Buried in the legalese was a threat: drain the creek within 30 days or face escalating penalties, starting at $500 and growing by the day. Rage bubbled in my chest, hot and immediate. Who were these people to tell me what I could do on my own land? Before I could process it fully, a knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of Ridgewood Valley and the HOA's Community Standards Director, standing there with her usual plastic smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she chirped, not bothering to hide the condescension in her voice. "I assume you received the notice about your water issue?" "It's a creek, Karen," I snapped, shoving the letter toward her. "And it's been here longer than any of us." She sighed dramatically, as if speaking to a child. "The HOA regulations are clear: open, unfenced water features pose a safety risk to the community." I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. A safety risk? It's barely ankle deep. Karen's expression hardened. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. If you don't comply, the fines will start accumulating. And after that, well, the HOA has ways of ensuring compliance." I clenched my fists as she strutted back to her car, the threat lingering in the air. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. And I'd be damned if I was going to let them win. The notice sat on my kitchen table, a glaring reminder of the battle ahead. My hands curled into fists as I read it again. Final warning: unauthorized water feature. Drainage must be completed within 25 days to avoid further penalties. My creek. My land. And yet, the HOA had decided they had the power to erase both with a stroke of their overpriced pens. I wasn't going to let them win that easily. Determined to understand exactly what I was up against, I grabbed a flashlight and a map of the neighborhood, then followed the creek upstream. It wound through my property, calm and steady as ever, before disappearing behind the towering privacy fences of Ridgewood Valley's newer section, the part of the neighborhood Karen and her cronies called home. I walked carefully, listening for anything unusual. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, something caught my eye. A metal pipe jutted out from beneath a cluster of rocks, half hidden by overgrown grass. Water trickled from it, water that wasn't coming from natural springs, but from the direction of the new houses. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about my creek. The HOA had rerouted water from their development into my property, using my land as an overflow basin to avoid dealing with their own drainage problems. I took photos, making sure to capture the location, the pipe, and the steady flow of water. Just as I pocketed my phone, a beam of light swept across the grass. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding. A golf cart rolled up near the pipe. Karen's husband, Richard, stepped out, glancing around before dumping something from a small container into the water. I squinted through the darkness. Whatever it was, it sent a dark sheen spreading across the creek. Poison. I barely contained my fury. They weren't just trying to get rid of the creek, they were polluting it. I watched as Richard drove away, completely unaware that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. If they thought I was going to roll over and comply, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The storm came fast, hammering against my roof and rattling the windows with a force that made the walls groan. Rain pounded the ground in thick sheets, and from my porch, I could see the water pooling along the edges of my yard, right where the creek once flowed freely. I clenched my jaw, gripping my flashlight as I pulled on my boots. Something was wrong. The rain shouldn't have been collecting like that. My land had always drained naturally, soaking up the runoff like a sponge. But now the water sat there, rising. I needed to see where it was going. I grabbed my phone and slipped out into the storm, the wind ripping at my jacket as I trudged toward the dry creek bed. My feet sank into the mud, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the far end of my property, where the HOA's pipe spewed water faster than I'd ever seen. My gut twisted. This wasn't just normal storm runoff. I followed the water's path, my flashlight flickering against the swirling currents. It wasn't draining properly. The natural flow had been destroyed when the HOA forced me to divert it, and now the water was backing up with nowhere to go. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard shouting. I turned, heart hammering. Flashlights bobbed between the houses farther up the hill, the silhouettes of panicked homeowners darting between driveways. The water was surging back toward their foundations. I gritted my teeth. Physics always wins. They thought they could fight nature, control it with rules and fines. But now their grand homes, the ones built atop the very wetlands they tried to erase, were drowning. I pulled out my phone, flipping on the camera just in time to catch the moment Karen and Richard stormed out onto their pristine, waterlogged lawn. Their driveway was already flooded. Their expensive landscaping submerged. They had no idea what was coming next. I backed away into the shadows, waiting. Tomorrow morning, they'd wake up to a disaster they created themselves. And I would have all the proof I needed to bring them down. The morning after the storm, I stood at the edge of my property, sipping my coffee as the neighborhood buzzed with chaos. Waterlogged furniture lined the streets, drenched rugs draped over fences in a desperate attempt to dry. The unmistakable scent of damp wood and sewage filled the air. But the real show was happening up the hill. Karen and Richard's house, the very symbol of HOA perfection, was now ground zero for the disaster. Their once pristine lawn had transformed into a swamp. Water still pooled in their driveway, creeping toward their front porch. The flood had swallowed their carefully curated flower beds whole, leaving behind nothing but tangled debris. I took another slow sip of my coffee as Karen stormed across her yard, phone clutched in her fist, barking orders to a group of frantic contractors. The HOA had created this problem, but now they were scrambling to pretend it wasn't their fault. I decided to take a stroll, casual as could be. "Morning, Karen," I called, stepping over a fallen mailbox. "Lovely day, isn't it?" She spun toward me, eyes flashing with fury. "You did this," she seethed. I raised an eyebrow. "Me? I didn't reroute a natural creek and block drainage systems. That was all you." Richard stomped over, mud splattering his designer loafers. This is a city infrastructure issue, he snapped. I mused, tilting my head. Odd, because the city had a perfectly functioning watershed system before your HOA decided to play God. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew I was right. That's when Elaine, one of my neighbors, walked up. "Hey, Jacob," she said loud enough for the surrounding residents to hear. "I heard your property didn't flood. Must be nice." A few heads turned in my direction. I shrugged, feigning innocence. "Guess that's what happens when you let nature do what it's meant to do." Karen's face turned ghostly pale. She realized, maybe for the first time, that she wasn't just losing control of the water, she was losing control of the neighborhood. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't just the lingering floodwaters or the sound of pumps whirring in driveways, it was the shift in people's eyes. The fear that Karen and the HOA had used to keep everyone in line was cracking, just like the foundations of their precious homes. And I was going to make sure that crack turned into a full-on collapse. I walked up to Elaine's house, where she and a few neighbors had gathered to assess the damage. Michael, the father of 3 who had been fined for leaving his garbage cans out a few minutes too long, was there, along with Sarah, whose family was now staying in a hotel because their basement had become a swamp. Their faces were tight with exhaustion, but there was something else there too, anger. "They're still blaming the city," Elaine muttered, shaking her head. Karen told the news crews that this was all an unfortunate weather event. "Right," I scoffed. "Because rain is a new phenomenon." Michael crossed his arms. "She's acting like this isn't their fault. That they didn't cause this by forcing you to destroy the creek. They think we'll just accept it," Sarah added bitterly. "That will pay for the damage, take the losses, and let them keep pretending they didn't do this." That's when I saw it, the spark. The realization that they didn't have to accept it. "Well," I said, voice steady, "what if we didn't?" They all turned to look at me. "What if we fought back? What if, for once, we stopped letting them bully us into submission?" Elaine exhaled sharply. "How?" I pulled out a folder I'd been putting together all night, filled with every document, map, and environmental report I'd found. I spread them out on the table. "We expose them," I said. "We take this to the press, to the city council, to every homeowner who's sick of the HOA acting like gods. We demand accountability." Michael's eyes scanned the reports, his jaw tightening. "And if they try to cover it up?" I smirked. "Then we make enough noise that they can't." For the first time since this all started, hope sparked in the room. By sunset, we had a plan. Sarah knew people at the local news station. Elaine's cousin worked for the city planning office. Michael had legal connections. We weren't just fighting back, we were preparing for war. And as we stood together, looking over the evidence we had gathered, the HOA's reign of terror was finally running out of time. The battle had officially begun. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the cracks in the HOA's control were spreading like the water seeping into their basements. Sarah had already contacted the news, and within hours, a reporter was standing in her front yard, cameras rolling as she held up a photograph of her flooded basement, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "The HOA forced our neighbor, Mr. Jacob, to remove a natural drainage creek that had been here for decades," she told them. "They claimed it was a danger, but all it did was keep our homes safe. And now look at us." Behind her, waterlogged furniture and ruined family photos sat in piles on the curb, a stark reminder of the destruction Karen and Richard had caused. Across the street, Michael was leading a group of neighbors in filing complaints with the county. They weren't waiting for the HOA to fix this, they were taking their demands straight to the officials. And I was in the thick of it all, armed with evidence, determination, and the knowledge that the truth was finally on our side. That afternoon, Karen and Richard called an emergency HOA meeting. When I walked into the community center, I could feel the tension in the air. The board sat stiffly at the front of the room, but for the first time, they didn't look powerful. They looked cornered. Karen stood, forcing a smile that did nothing to hide the panic in her eyes. "We understand the frustrations of our residents and want to assure you that we are working on a resolution," she said smoothly. I raised my hand, but I didn't wait for permission to speak. "You mean the resolution where you blame the city and pretend this isn't your fault?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen's jaw clenched. "That's an unfair accusation." "No," I cut in, voice steady. "What's unfair is watching families lose their homes while you lie to protect yourselves." For the first time, Karen had no response. The tides were shifting, and she knew it. The HOA wasn't in control anymore. We were. The storm had passed, but the damage had already been done, not to me, not to the families Karen had tormented, but to the very people who had orchestrated this disaster. Karen's pristine, landscaped lawn had become a swamp. Richard's precious custom driveway had cracked from the shifting earth beneath it. The Westfields' grand house, their symbol of power, was now sinking into the very ground they had tried to control. I stood on the sidewalk, watching as a restoration crew waded through knee-deep water in front of their home. Their foundation was compromised, their basement was a lake, and their once glorious property was rapidly becoming unlivable. I didn't need to say a word, but Karen spotted me anyway. She was soaked, her hair a mess, her usual smug expression twisted in frustration. She marched toward me, splashing through the muddy water like a woman on the verge of collapse. "This is your fault," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. I almost laughed. "My fault?" I gestured around at the destruction. I wasn't the one who redirected a natural waterway and ignored every warning. "You did this." Her nostrils flared. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, my voice calm. "You spent years bullying people, making their lives miserable over minor infractions, and now, when it really matters, no one's coming to save you." As if on cue, Sarah Thompson walked up beside me. "The same HOA that fined me for leaving my garbage cans out for an extra hour. The same HOA that rejected Michael's solar panel request 3 times. You expect us to feel sorry for you?" Karen's eyes darted to the crowd forming behind us, the very people she had once controlled, now watching her downfall like a long overdue reckoning. I turned to Sarah and shrugged. "I guess water finds its own level." The irony was almost too perfect. She had tried to control nature. Now, nature was reclaiming what was rightfully hers. And Karen was drowning in the consequences. The fallout from the flooding spread faster than the water itself. Karen and Richard had spent years weaponizing the HOA against the neighborhood, but now the very people they tormented were watching them drown, figuratively and, in a way, literally. Their once glorious home, perched at the highest point of the development, was now a disaster zone. Walls were cracking, the foundation was sinking, and every attempt to pump out the water only led to more bubbling up from below. The land they had built their empire on had turned against them, just as the people they had ruled over finally had. At the next emergency HOA meeting, Karen and Richard showed up looking like ghosts of their former selves. Gone were the crisp suits, the smug smiles, the air of untouchable superiority. They were exhausted, drained, both figuratively and financially. They wanted help. They wanted sympathy. But they had built no bridges, only burned them. I motioned for the HOA to approve emergency funds for flood repairs, Richard announced, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Silence. The same homeowners they had fined, harassed, and humiliated over the years stared at them, unmoved. Elaine stood, folding her arms. "And why should we do that, Richard?" He cleared his throat. "Because we're a community." That got a bitter laugh from the crowd. Sarah stood next. "You mean the same community you fined into financial ruin? The same community you abandoned when we needed help?" Karen's face darkened, but she held her tongue. She knew arguing would only make things worse. Michael leaned forward. So, let me get this straight. You're asking us, the people you've abused for years, to bail you out. Silence stretched in the room like a thick fog. Let's put it to a vote, I said finally. The ballots were counted in minutes. The answer was a resounding no. Richard and Karen sat frozen, realizing the truth. The power they once wielded was gone. The community they had tried to control had finally broken free, and they were now completely alone. The next morning, I stood on my back porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over my newly restored creek. Water once again flowed freely, carving its natural path through the land, as if the whole ordeal had never happened. Birds chirped from the trees, and dragonflies skimmed the surface. It was as if nature itself was celebrating. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. But the real victory came later that afternoon when I received a certified letter from the county. I tore it open, my pulse quickening as I read the first line. The Maple Valley Homeowners Association is under formal investigation for environmental violations and unlawful property modifications. I let out a slow, satisfied breath. It was official. The same governing bodies Karen and Richard had manipulated for years were now turning their scrutiny on them. Their empire of fines, bylaws, and intimidation had collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. As word spread, neighbors began stopping by. Elaine showed up with a bottle of champagne. "It's over," she said, popping the cork with a triumphant grin. Michael arrived with his wife and kids, shaking my hand firmly. "You didn't just save your creek," he said. "You saved all of us." And then there was Sarah Thompson, standing at the edge of my yard, her son Timmy by her side. "The frogs are back," he whispered excitedly. I looked down and sure enough, tiny green specks leapt from rock to rock. Life was returning. At that moment, a moving truck pulled up to Karen and Richard's house. They stood by the curb, looking utterly defeated as workers loaded boxes into the truck. Karen caught my eye. For a second, I thought she might say something, some final, bitter remark. But instead, she simply turned away, retreating into the shadow of the very house that had once been her kingdom. The HOA had fallen. The land was healing. The community had reclaimed its power. And as the creek continued its endless journey forward, so did we. With the HOA's reign of terror officially over, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. Gone were the constant violation notices taped to doors, the passive-aggressive emails about lawn height, the surveillance-like patrols of Karen and her cronies. Instead, people began to breathe again, quite literally, as the last of the floodwaters receded, leaving behind the scars of destruction but also the promise of renewal. I spent the first few days after the victory helping my neighbors clean up what the HOA had nearly destroyed. Sarah Thompson's basement had been gutted and was finally dry, but the walls still bore water stains, a lingering reminder of the chaos. She caught my arm as I carried a load of ruined furniture to the curb. "It should have never come to this," she murmured, shaking her head. "But at least now, we get to decide what happens next." She was right. The community had been broken, but now we had the rare chance to rebuild it, this time, on our terms. At the emergency HOA meeting, our first without Karen and Richard at the helm, Elaine Wong stood at the podium. "It's time for real leadership," she declared, her voice steady and clear. "Not intimidation. Not fines. Not personal vendettas disguised as community standards." The room erupted into applause. The days of power-hungry tyrants ruling over our homes were over. Elaine was elected as the new HOA president by an overwhelming majority, alongside a fresh board composed of neighbors who actually wanted to help, not control. Their first act. A complete overhaul of the bylaws, stripping away the absurd regulations Karen had weaponized for years. When the meeting ended, neighbors lingered outside, talking and laughing. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as small pockets of people formed, swapping stories, offering help, reconnecting. For the first time in years, Riverstone Heights didn't feel like a collection of houses, it felt like a community. Elaine found me in the parking lot. "You know," she said, nudging my arm, "this wouldn't have happened without you." I glanced toward the creek, where water once again flowed freely under the moonlight. "No," I said with a small smile. "It happened because we finally stood together." The air felt different that morning, lighter, freer. For the first time in years, our neighborhood wasn't living under the weight of HOA threats and intimidation. No more fines for mailbox colors, no more forced removals of harmless garden decorations, and most importantly, no more reckless environmental destruction disguised as safety regulations. Neighbors gathered at the community center that afternoon, not for another suffocating HOA meeting, but for something better, a restoration project. Elaine, our new HOA president, had called for volunteers, and the response had been overwhelming. Families, retirees, and even teenagers who had once been scolded for playing basketball in their driveways all showed up, eager to repair what the previous board had tried to erase. Shovels struck the earth as we worked to restore the creek, clearing debris and replanting native greenery. Children ran barefoot along the banks, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension that once ruled our streets. Sarah Thompson's kids placed tiny wooden signs in the dirt, labeling plants that had begun to sprout again. "This one's for the frogs," Timmy announced proudly, planting a sign next to the water's edge. Across the way, Richard and Karen's former house sat vacant, a testament to their downfall. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, the very creek they tried to destroy was now a symbol of their failure and our victory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around a makeshift picnic setup. Someone passed around lemonade, and neighbors, once strangers, shared stories of perseverance and defiance. This was what a community was supposed to be. Not ruled by power-hungry bureaucrats, but built on unity, respect, and resilience. I stood by the creek, watching the water flow freely once more. Nature had found its way back, and so had we.